My presentation is based on a draft book chapter with the title Inclusion and Exclusion in Local Governance, a spatial lens on a field study from Benin. This chapter has a history which goes back, and I now mention it, it goes back to a joint symposium with Barbara, among others, at ACFED. And I think this was the starting point when I started to think and to think through a spatial lens on my research topic. I won't go into detail here. What I want to do today is to introduce you very briefly to the post-development and spatial framework. And this combination emerged much more strongly during the Viva, and then briefly talk about the methodology and the context. The second part is more empirical, where I talk about inclusion and exclusion based on the data. And the third one is more theoretical, and there I will reflect on the use of the spatial theorization and the kind of data I have, with some questions opening up the discussion afterwards. The first part is the contextual and conceptual part. In this chapter, I explored two different questions relating to the second and third part. The first one is, how do actors involved in the delivery of pre- and primary education participate in policy implementation? And what are the implications for inclusion? And then the second one, which refers to the third theoretical part, how do space and place frame questions of participation, power, and inclusion differently? In terms of the relevance, I mean, sometimes I'm slightly tired myself about education decentralization because it's such a well-researched area, and but it continues to be a key global governance reform with major implications for equity and inclusion. And I think most research has been done from a structural perspective, and often within the development categories, which I will elaborate later on. I think in using this framework, we are able to see the multiple complexities of local practices and also how they affect process of exclusion and inclusion. So first of all, I'd like to share how I frame inclusion. And as you can see on the slide, I frame it in relation to participation and power. And as you can see with the authors I'm working with, Arnstein, who has a very structural approach to participation, which in itself is a problematic concept. I will come to it in a minute. And then power informed by Foucault, so contrasting a structural and a rather post-structural understanding in relation to inclusion. And that will be also, in a way, the leitmotif of this presentation, how these different perspectives can be in conversation. I won't read out the definition of participation. I used it because I haven't found another way of framing inclusion when talking about education governance, and more specifically education decentralization. I highlighted the terms excluded, included, so broadly could be understood as indicating a degree or the possibility of being involved in something. Arnstein developed a ladder of participation, which is highly problematic because it's a oversimplification. But he says himself there are 150 ranks with less sharp and pure distinctions. I already alluded to this in one of the previous decol presentations. Participation in itself has a connotation of the modernities surrounding discourse of decentralization, such as development, planning, participation. And I'm referring with this to Wolfgang Sachs' 2010. And also what is problematic, or what I want to highlight is that I reject the view that power and participation are possessed or fixed within people or groups of people, but rather see them as dynamic and multi-directional, fluid and open to change. And you will hear Foucault here. So I think a Foucauldian understanding of power helps to unpack decentralization as an inherently structural concept, to shed light on some of the complex and unstable dimensions of the enactment. Some aspects I'm sure you're familiar with. Power can come from below, and translating it to decentralization, power can be exercised at various levels and among various actors, and it's changing. And another point is the idea of resistance, so how a policy can also be resisted, which I will hopefully elaborate on when I talk through the data. Yeah, in terms of the framework, as you can see, I'm combining a post-development perspective with a spatial perspective. The post-development framework is, let's say, the architecture, the macro architecture, and the spatial analysis or perspective allows a fine-grained analysis of the substantive. So in terms of why these two different frameworks, or why I decided to combine them, I think post-development is more than important when talking about decentralization, which is in itself a development discourse and product. And Benin not only has a colonial past, but is also highly influenced. Okay, thank you, Balbia. I asked for a sign in terms of time. It's good to know. It's my understanding of it, that's very reductionist, but it's as being critical of the Eurocentric dimension of development. And I think it helps us to provide a nuanced critique of development discourses, and also to think about alternatives. For the spatial, it has been acknowledged by policy and researchers in the area of policy analysis, such as Rizvi and Lingard, that the spatial theorization is important because spatial relations overlap in the education policy cycle. Sadly, I don't have much time to go into detail of the spatial theorization here, but just to highlight that I understand space I understand the relations between space and place as social constructions, and that helps to shed light on the multiple and simultaneous social relations involved in the mediation of policy. Yeah, to go quite quickly then to the second part, I just like to let you know that the study based on my doctoral research was much bigger, but for the book chapter in this presentation, I used the data from 4 focus group discussions and 9 interviews with municipal actors, teachers, and parents. And I chose 2 different field sites in the southeast and the northeast of Benin. And now I just need to take a look into my notes, which I took. The field sites can be broadly categorized as urban in the south and semi-urban in the north. And the southern field site has a relatively high socio-economic status and high educational outcomes. There is no significant gender gap at the end of primary school. There are numerous religious private schools, Catholic private schools, and it used to be the place where the colonial negotiations took place. Obviously, Benin as a country has a colonial history, but that was the particular place where the negotiations took place. And then the northern field site is semi-urban with a medium socioeconomic status and relatively low educational outcomes. There is a slight gender gap at the end of primary school. There is no particular history in this place, and according to respondents, there is less stratification. And yeah, there are many Quran schools because of a majority of Muslims, and that's where I will elaborate on a dominant presence of NGOs. Yeah, I will come to the second part that we will have enough, hopefully enough time to see the data in itself. I would like to share visual data with you. So just give me a second to share it with you. Here we are. Okay, great. So now I address the question of how actors involved in the delivery of pre and primary education participate in implementing a policy. I don't have time to go into the methodological details of how these actor maps have been produced, were produced. It was part of the focus group discussions with teachers in pre and primary schools in both field sites. And it was around the topic of school infrastructure because that's the only devolved competence or responsibility. And so to think about actors and also in terms of power, how they navigate the process of building and equipping schools. So I try to show it. Yeah, so I think you can see most of the 4 maps. Is that right?
Yeah, it is.
Okay, great. Yeah, so you can see that, for example, in the north, and these are the yellow actor maps. You can see that municipal actors, NGOs, and teachers and parents were in close to the center, whereas in the south we have the education ministry and the town council. But I think what is more important is that these maps represent the messiness and the complexities of local practices. And there are these different actors who connect with each other in various ways, and they bring about certain discourse and social practices which are temporarily stabilized. And now I will go back to the PowerPoint presentation. So I will share again and go back to the decol. Yeah, so the findings from a structural perspective, the findings point to the strengthening of municipal government entities, to the exclusion of the voices of parents, and to and I'm very cautious, but a kind of maintaining the power of NGOs. I give you a second to read the quote. That gives me some time to breathe. Okay. I mean, from a legal perspective, town councils only exist because of the decentralization reform. And as you can see in the quote, the town council is part of 2 out of 3 scenarios. So it can be considered as a relatively influential or reinforced actor at the local level. The second point is about parents who were formerly, or historically rather, they played quite an important role in the delivery of pre and primary education. But today, and that was quite a homogeneous theme, they felt being not part of the delivery of education anymore, as you can see in the quote. And in a way, the decentralization of education can also considered as a centralization trend at the municipal level, because then parents who were previously in charge of different things are not formally part of the delivery of education anymore. Yeah, while the voices of parents tend to be excluded in policy processes, NGOs maintain their influence, as we can see in the third quote, and that's particularly visible in the north. So here in the quote, you can see that NGOs navigated the system in parallel with government structures. Yeah, so also how they are able to bypass the local government in both field sites. I'd like to come to the third part now, because I don't feel very comfortable with this structural analysis of inclusion in terms of local governance. But I think we need, I decided to include it as a, as a step in the analysis. So now I will reflect, or I will use a spatial lens to think through the data, as opposed to what I've done until now, and then open up for questions. Am I still in the time frame, Balbir?
Yes, so it's at 1:30, just gone past 1:30.
Okay, great. Yeah, so far I've discussed how power is unequally distributed within the local communities and their spaces in Benin. But as I said previously, these relationships are not fixed. And there is a great journal article from Berghout in 2005, who said, or who suggests, decentralization can be theorized as manifesting itself in dynamic and potentially changeable actor networks, implying a dynamic and fluid understanding of inclusion. And that's an argument I very much buy into. Yeah, the nuances of a spatial lens. Again, I'm very aware that postmodernists don't differentiate between place and space, and that makes it so difficult for me. And that's something I would love to hear your views about it in the discussion. So when I thought, or I looked at the data from a spatial perspective, I used two different entry points. If I conceptualize these two different field sites as social relations stretched out, and I quote Massey here, the first analysis points to the presence and power of NGOs in the north and the existence and influence of the central administration in the south. So we've seen in the actor maps very briefly how in the southern field site, teachers positioned the central administration as an influential actor, whereas in the north, we've seen it in the actor maps, but also in the interview data, the NGOs play an important role. And these observations can be understood in terms of different geographical contexts, presumably due to the weaker socio-economic situation of the northern field site and weaker educational outcomes. This makes it very attractive for NGOs to intervene, and then also through their discourses, but also more material things such as funding to position themselves in the setting. And yes, in the south, the southern field site is also home to the education ministry. So maybe just in terms of the physical or the closeness, it seems the education ministry seems to be a powerful actor to teachers. So, and now I come for myself, and I hope hopefully for you as well, to a more exciting theorization. So, and I will read this out because it's still working in my mind. While the place of the action exemplified in the field sites shed light on the different actors involved in policy mediation, the concept of space is more complex and fluid. The spatial perspective can capture the simultaneity and multiplicity of discourses and practices, illustrating how power relations are distributed, but also exercised within society. I talked about the messiness of the discursive and social practices previously, which have become quite visible in the visual data. And I'm quoting Ball, 1993, I think I would need to look this up, but who talks about a wild profusion of local practices for policy mediation. And this can be considered as, and now I quote Dubois, 1991, as a multiplicity of localized hierarchizations. And yeah, now contrasting these ideas with decentralization, which is saturated with a singular discourse, referring back to the developed underdeveloped binary, so a temporal, linear temporal dimension underpinning or informing development. And I think a spatial lens avoids the view of development as linear, but it reveals how the development paradigm can be resisted through multiple and simultaneous contestation. So in very simple words, I think the spatial is helpful to break the moments where the structural is problematic. Yeah. I just had a look at the time. I will wrap up now, if that's fine, Balbir.
Yep, that's absolutely fine. Thank you very much, Eva, for sharing your study and your research. The chapter is also available, but if anyone would like to ask any questions or comment on what Eva has shared, please do share.
Okay, and if you don't mind, I just will say 2-3 sentences to wrap up my talk. Yeah. So I won't repeat what I've already said. I just read the last paragraph. Instead of considering the local as a deficit or restricted input, it can in fact be found in the universal policy informed by the dominant development discourses. And I pre-conclude, I would say, that full and meaningful inclusion remains a challenge to the delivery of pre- and primary education in local contexts beyond or outside global governance policies. And when I introduced the post-development framework, I said it's also a way of thinking about alternatives. And I like to quote Massey in a podcast from 2013 again, who says, space conceptualized as multiplicity and simultaneity, and now I quote her, opens up politics to the possibility of alternatives. I leave open which these alternatives are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eva. Any questions?
I think you can all still see the PowerPoint presentation. I noted a couple of questions, but I'm very happy to have a conversation around the things you would be interested in.
I think Gunjan, you had your hand up.
I was clapping, Bulbir. I was just doing the
So, yeah, the reactions are a little bit funny sometimes in terms of how
they are.
Interpreted. Yeah. And any other comments or questions? Okay, I had one just as a query really, is this concept of funding and those who are providing funding for education having the greater influence. I think you talked about the NGOs and the funding that they brought. How is that having an impact on the provision of the education that's being provided where they do have that power?
Mm-hmm. It's nothing I looked at it in detail, but although it has been a dominant topic in the interview data, I mean, in a way, we could argue that the devolved responsibility is still quite restricted because it's only infrastructure, which has been which was devolved at the municipal level. But at the same time, that's quite an important sector. There is much funding involved, which is transferred from the ministerial level to the municipalities. I mean, I can just assume, but yeah, I assume that NGOs play an important role. As we have seen, NGOs, the role of NGOs, they can bypass the central and the local government and just construct schools in practice. So yeah, yes.
There seems to be quite a lot of interesting work around NGOs and what role they play. And you use the term actors, and they are actors who have a huge impact on other actors and how they understand. And that influence, you can call it influence, I think, or you can call it power that they hold in the form of money is not something to ignore. I think it's something quite an important factor to realize that with money comes a lot of other things as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely, and there was this quote when teachers talked about the various possibilities to how they can go about to build a school and these various actor constellations. And the legal framework is very clear. It's the local school, not the town council who is in charge. But the perception and the discourse practices show that it's much more complex. There are many more possibilities. And I mean, that brings me away from the funding aspect, which is important as well. I don't want to diminish this, but going back to this quote when they talked about parents can cooperate with the town council or NGOs with the, so for me, it's also a way of resisting a policy paradigm which hasn't come through in my presentation, but which I would just like to share. So.
Okay, thank you. Any other? Barbara sends her love in the chat, so.
I was actually trying to say that I've got a question.
Oh, okay, sorry. I just thought it was sending love. Sorry, Barbara.
No problem, no problem. I don't know how the extent that these conventions kind of are shared from place to place or whatever. But it was just, thank you very much, Eva. That was really interesting. I just wanted to ask more about, you know, where you're getting this issue from that postmodernists don't distinguish between space and place. Are you referring specifically to Massey there? Because for me, she seems to define them differently, but in ways that do distinguish between them. So I'm kind of interested by that. And then also just what is the, you know, in your turn to the spatial, are you using this to critique actor network theory and how it treats space and place, or are you sitting them alongside each other? Thanks very much.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for your questions, Barbara. I must say I haven't a response to your second one. I would need to think through. But in terms of space and place, just let me have a look in my notes. I think Massey, in my memory, Massey maybe contradicts herself also. On the one hand, I agree, she has a particular definition for space and another one for place, and also how it is to be understood together. And I can read the small paragraph from my notes, but at the same time, in my memory, she also says it's not to be separated, and that makes it for me so difficult, because what I try to highlight in or through my data, we can conceptualize space in terms of the different field sites, which would be rather place and highlight the different implications for inclusion, or we can have a broader understanding of space as social relations, stretched out, whatever that might mean, and to think in terms of the complexities and the complexities of local practices and discourses. Just 1 second. So what I took out for myself is that the spatial cannot be reduced to a place understood as a particular position, point, or area in space. And Massey says, place is, and I quote her, the image of one's place in the world. A place can be considered as, and I quote her again, a particular articulation of relations, a particular moment in networks of social relations and understandings, and implying a specific articulation between networks of social relations. And space, according to Massey, is defined as the realm of the dead or the chaos of simultaneity and multiplicity. And what I say then is that I conceptualize the spatial as the multiple and simultaneously happening social relations. I don't know if maybe you have any thoughts. I'm sure I mean, you're very experienced with the spatial theorization, what your ideas are
So all
about
the
it.
emphasis on the production of space through local social relations, I kind of see that sitting, I mean, that's what my understanding of Massey, how her emphasis on space is on the local social relations and the history of those relations, that has, that comes together in, in a particular context. And place, location, is related to location. So she's very critical of a modern understanding of space as that kind of container, which is all about just a kind of, a kind of place, a pin on a map kind of thing, and the ways modern understandings of space have reduced it to place. So she's highlighting the local social relations that produce that and their histories, actually. Those articulations are a product of relations that have a socio-historical trace, if you want. So I don't see them necessarily as dismissing the distinction. I think they're critical of modern understandings of space and reducing it just to place. It's bringing in the social hierarchies and the social relations through which space is produced, this relational sense.
No, I completely agree, and I acknowledge that I did it partly, but then try to break with this reduced understanding of place. And in terms of actor network theory, I haven't used it in this chapter. I didn't want to overload the conceptualization and the analysis. But going back to your question, I think mean, what maybe they have in common is that actor network theory rejects or is this something they have in common, or a contradiction? But actor network theory wouldn't think or wouldn't give importance to the context, but only to the actors and how they connect with each other and develop. And so it's not the context which explains a discourse or social practice, something which becomes powerful and stabilized. But I can see Mairead.
Sorry, I didn't mean to frighten you. Is it okay for me to come in, Balbir? Yeah, okay. And I want to just point out that also the issue of time isn't excluded from Massey's analysis either. It still remains important, but it doesn't remain singularly important. It broadens the way that we have to think about social life, I think. I guess I wasn't really going to extend that, except to say that some of what you're talking about, I will also be talking about, but not in the way that you're talking about it. I'm looking at process of decentralisation, but in a different way. And I guess my question then for you is about how you're going into your data and analysis. I mean, we've got this actor network theory, if you like. We've got this spatial analysis. We've got structural and post-structural things going on. And they seem to be there overbearing on some sense of a reading of what people are saying to you. So I'm asking you a methodological question, really. I'm asking you about what would it give you if you listened to people and tried to think about what they're saying the other way up, instead of almost putting a sense of a theoretical framework onto the data. What would it look like the other way around?
That's a question which makes me think. And to give me some more time, I really look forward to your presentation, because you talk about education decentralization and you're using a spatial analysis. And I think that's still something I need to think through more thoroughly. But what I got from your question is, if I just look at the data without the post-development or spatial framework, what would it be like? Is that right?
Yeah.
I think it would very much refer to the second part of the presentation, where I talk about the strengthening of government entities and the potential exclusion of parents. And that's a structural approach to understanding decentralization, and I will go back to Berghaut's argument. She considers the enactment of decentralization as manifesting in networks, in relations, as something which is dynamic and fluid. Because maybe what I would like to highlight is that this data reflects a particular moment in time and place, and that this is subject to change. So do you ask me what what would be different without this conceptual framework?
I think I'm asking you to give me more of those unruly practices and discourses and interactions that were happening in the local, rather than the frame. I think, obviously we're all researchers. For us, some theoretical frames important, and in fact, changes in that theoretical frame are important as we do research. So I think I wanted more of the mess. I didn't want to be so tidy.
I think you spoke, I think Eva, just
yeah,
sorry, just to
yeah,
add to what
please
Maria,
go.
I mean, you spoke
Yeah.
about the messiness and the complexities. You were talking, just, I mean, having the data do the talking of that messiness and the complexities that you were speaking about when you were quoting Massey. So I don't know if Maria's saying that, because there's a lot of that in your data from the work that I've read of yours. There's so much of that messiness, of that unruliness in the voices that you sort of captured. So
yeah, I mean, I think I get what you mean. At some point, I think the data is also limited with oral data or interview data, focus group data. And if I could go again into the field, I think I would use or draw more heavily on observations and not only human actors. I think the visual data, the actor maps, there are 4 different scenarios, and even though the legal framework is very clear, or we could have a very clean or tidied up picture, in your words, Marit, I think. We can see on the 4 maps, and I can show them again, that the perceptions are so different about who is involved, what is the process, who are powerful actors. So every map reflects a very particular perception of how the policy is mediated. And I think that goes back to the localized hierarchizations or processes, which Dubois talks about, or I would say Massey allocates importance to it. But maybe you have further ideas about how the data can be framed from a spatial perspective. The 2 minutes remaining.
Yeah, we
Sorry,
have.
Balbi.
I don't know if you'd like to respond, Mayrad?
Oh gosh. Well, I just think what I was thinking was that you might, I didn't get a strong depiction from what you were doing of what the local social relations were. I got your impressions of them, but I didn't have any particular evidence or extracts, whatever, for me to see that. So that's one thing. And there were also different sites. So what difference did the different relationships in different particular spaces and places, what difference did that make to whatever educational decentralisation was trying to accomplish? So maybe a link back to the other question, I'm not sure.
I take these questions back to the revision of the chapter, I think.
And I think
Suleiman also, oh sorry.
Sorry, yeah. Suleiman.
I thought Suleiman was saying something.
Well, yeah, I just had a comment, indeed, not a question, but it can turn up to a question considering the time. I don't want to go into it, but what my point was that referring to this sort of decentralization of the educational theme, to what extent the decentralization itself is a political doctrine and being instrumentalized through the central governments. And if I could present an example in terms of religious education in UK, it's not part of the national curriculum, it's referred to basic curriculum, which local authorities have to have the power to influence, considering the demographical social relation of different minorities into that. And I was just thinking about Barnet Borough, where I live. For example, 10.3% of Barnet Borough is Muslims, and they have one representative in the so-called Advisory Council for Religious Education, while they have 0.4% of Sikh population, and they have got few. So how that doctrine of decentralization is in a way used to to politicize the education at the local level. That
Yeah.
was my question.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely also part of the data, politicization. I couldn't go into that today, but that's something which have been a preoccupation by teachers also regarding the question about how they envision education in terms of sharing of power, of responsibilities. So.
Well, thank you very much, Eva, for sharing that. I think there's quite a lot of interesting conversation, discussion